So as front-end devs, this also applies to backend as well, right? Oftentimes we are carried away with designing for or building for complexity, not necessarily over engineering, right? Things around, if you're a front-end dev and I say something around, oh, I'm a front-end dev and I want to speak on something, right? The usual suspect to be things around probably maybe API, right? Or say code architecture or things around that, right? But over the years, I think I've come to realize that one thing that's very important is, or are the little details, right? Because most times, if for instance, so at a very high level, if for instance you have a, let's say, form, right? And that form has a call to action or a button, what happens is, usually when you click on that button, we expect some form of, let's say an API call, right? So what happens is, on that text, the text on that button now, for instance, usually when you click on that button, what happens is your client, right, your browser makes a request to the server and then gets information. But what happens for the end user is very important as well, which is that button, that text, that little detail. How do they know to expect a response from the server, right? So those are things that's an example of something that constitutes what a micro interaction is. Because micro interaction is not just all about something sliding across the screen, or it's essentially an interaction. So micro there stands for or means small, right? Little interaction. But the difference between a good product and a great product, right, are the little details. Like how well are you able to nail those little details? Essentially, attention to details, right? So next slide, please, right? So as I said earlier, so micro interaction are essentially the subtle details, right? That makes a difference in how users experience your website. So from the hover effect, you have a button and then, so a button is clickable, but there's no micro interaction. So an example of a micro interaction on a basic button will be like a hover effect, right? So a button that knows that a button that the user knows, for instance, to click. So once you have a button, it's not enough that you just have a button or you have a button and you move forward, right? Can the user sense that this button has an interaction to it, right? So for elements like that, or components like that, if you are creating maybe a design system in, say, React, right, front-end frameworks, all of that, it's not enough for you to just dump the button on that page with the text, right? In some cases, depends on your hue, right? It's possible a user mistakes a button for being clickable when in essence is disabled, right? So micro interactions would be able to just give the user that upfront hints as to how to interact with your product. So the animations like sound, visual cues, right? So for instance, on I think Twitter, when you click a like, when you like a post rather, right? There's this animation, there's this effect that happens on the heart icon, right? So that's an example of a pretty sweet micro interactions. Yeah, so micro interactions implies it is about the small things, but not the unimportant, right? So at this point, I'll go into what micro interactions are, right? So they are small contained moments that accomplish a single task. They often go unnoticed. Now, an example of one that will go unnoticed is if you have, again, if you have a button or if you have a call to action, essentially. A call to action doesn't necessarily have to be a button. It could be a link, right? But they play a vital role in improving user interactions, right? So engagement, just imagine you had a service like Facebook, for instance, or Twitter. And when you click the like button on Twitter, it just switches states from lined to fill. You know what I mean by line to fill is the heart icon is just made up of an outline, like an SVG outline, right? When you click on it, it becomes fill red without any micro interactions. It will kind of cause it will work fine, but there will be less engagement as to when you have it very dynamic. Because I don't know if most of us on Twitter here will remember cases where you're on Twitter, and then what happens is, I think every now and then they introduce a custom like effect on maybe the like button, right? These will cause engagements. It causes a lot of people to click on the button, right? So that's an example of how micro-interaction can be used for good. The engagement is very, and also something important I also forgot to include here is, if you are thinking about micro-interaction, it's not just for fancy, essentially, right? So it serves a purpose, right? And the purpose is to draw engagement, because if you are solving for business goals, right, to meet business objectives, one thing that's very important, even as devs, as designers, one thing that is very important is to prioritize business goals, right, over design, essentially, right, over how beautiful it looks, right, over how beautiful. Prioritizing business objectives is very important, and also accessibility. So if there is a button, I assume that we know things that should be in place as far as accessibility, right? So that a visually impaired user will know what is currently going on the button, if it's clickable, and all of that. For an item, right, or for a button, a component to constitute or to satisfy the criteria of being a micro-interaction, right? They must have like 4 main components, one of which is trigger, right? Now that trigger is very important in the sense that, like I was saying, I was using button as examples, but not all triggers are carried out by the user. An example is, if, for instance, if you are filling a form, maybe you are filling a form, a company website, or any form whatsoever. What happens is, usually the system would, by itself, trigger some response, right, for you to know what's going on. Now, that's an example of a micro-interaction. So it can be triggered from or by either myself, being the end user, or the system itself, right? The second part of this, as far as like components that satisfies what can be considered a micro-interaction is, or are the rules, right? Now, rules essentially is the one where you click on the button, what happens, right? There's different ways, in as much as I use the button. An example of a very good micro-interaction is loading animation, spinner, right? So there are times you decide to go between just a basic spinner and a skeleton loader, right? So a skeleton loader, for instance, is useful when you have when your information kind of has a structure to it. So if you have, let's say you have like Facebook now, Facebook has a layout, Twitter has a layout, right? It's different from a blog post. A blog post will typically have a layout, but for the most part, a layout for a blog post is dynamic, right? So if you have a structured layout, right, a layout that can easily be, let's say, so the word I'm looking for is like, they cannot necessarily determine a layout that can kind of be, the user expects a certain layout. Like for instance, if you come to Twitter, we know that on Twitter, you have the navigation by the top, your profile item by the left, and the content on the right, right? Now that's an example of a layout that would not change, would never change except there's an update to the system. So in that case, you want to go for a skeleton loader. So that's as far as rules, right? So what happens as far as your micro-interaction? What should happen when a trigger happens? If you come to a page that contains a load more button, when you click on that page, what happens is that you make an API call again, and then we expect response from the server, right? So the system itself is the one triggering the load more action at this time, right? So that's as far as rules. Feedback is the user has to know what's going on in your web application. If there's an error in your form field, you should kind of provide feedback to the user, right? For the final on loops and modes, that essentially means how often should your micro-interactions play, like as far as like the loop, how many times should it show? Should it just be something that shows once, inform the user once, and then they can dismiss that information? Or is something that for every step of the user journey, you want to communicate with them what is essentially going on? Now, yeah, so benefits of micro interactions. We have enhancing user experience, which is very important because obsessing over the user is something that, as products, we don't typically do enough. You often see, not necessarily just old code bases, you often see devs these days, most devs, as far as I'm concerned, most devs, especially when you're working on a personal project, you tend to prioritize functionality, right? And by functionality, I mean like how clean your code is. In as much as all this is important for readability and all of that, but in my experience, people or places where you see people prioritize user experience are mostly larger companies. But for a small company or as a startup or as a dev essentially working on your own project, what is very important is user experience because if you want to engage each and every user, you want as much as possible to kind of not leave any user not converted essentially, right? So micro interactions they help you do that very well. Now an example of this is you have two buttons, so which is something I was trying to show earlier. You have two buttons. Now a button just contains the text loading on it, and you have another button that contains the same thing essentially, right? When the user clicks on one button, right, the button A makes an API call to some server now, for instance, right? And then all that changes on that button, let's say contact us. Now when you click on that button, that text of contact us just changes to loading because you clicked on it, of course, right? Now that loading is not enough queue to the user because what happens is that if you say loading for how long? Right, that's why you often see, I think that's a problem a spinner solves, right? And it depends on how fast your spinner goes as well. So a spinner, an indicator that just shows that, oh, there is an interaction. Because if your request takes, let's say a minute, right? A minute is obviously too long for a basic request, right? Say your API call takes a minute, and you just show loading to user, just a loading text without any spinner, right? I could assume that, as a user, I would assume that there's nothing going on in your app, right? But if you have a spinning indicator, something that tells the user that, the request is in process, essentially. Now, usability here means that for the user, it would reduce or, in some cases, eliminate frustration, right? Because you want a scenario whereby, like a button, for instance. Now, another example I will give with the button is if you have a button that when you click, it gives a pulsating effect, right? Now, that pulsating effect kind of mimics a real life behavior of maybe any button, right? Because at the end of the day, digital products, like when we design for the web, we're essentially taking more. We're taking more of how we interact with things online, but on digital form. So, for instance, you have a switch where you click on and off, or a button you press. You typically want to replicate that user experience on the web, whereby if they click, they should know that this button was clicked. Not necessarily acting like a switch, but a pulsating effect, just something subtle. So, types of micro interactions to consider. You would, types of micro interactions. So user onboarding micro interactions, these are interactions that you want to implement when you are carrying this user through the onboarding journey. For one of those, a popular example is Joyride. When you have a dashboard, something like Slack, right? You will have things like you click maybe some dots where you click next, that dot can move to the next place to kind of guide the user through the journey essentially. System status is also a very popular example, like loading bars, the spinners like I mentioned earlier. Action feedback, those are things like Ojeh effects. I went through that as well. And the final one is delight, right? So the delight part is just something that just makes user happy. Everything doesn't necessarily have to solve a problem. Some things can just be to kind of reward the user. For instance, the idea of a confetti. So best practices for designing micro interactions, right? Consistency with brand and tone. This is very important because if you have a service like, let's say, a security service, right, and you're designing for that, right, in as much as this will appeal to more or less designers, right, but if you are designing for a very serious service, the way your micro interactions work, or your interaction in general, the way it will move, right, has to reflect that brand. You can't be moving, let's say you click a button and then the loading animation is pulsing at a very slow rate. Timing and subtlety, right, essentially has to do with sequence, right, how you create your micro interactions. Functional and purposeful design, that has to do with each design or each micro interaction should serve a particular purpose as to having a purpose. Essentially, whenever you create a micro interaction, no matter how small, have the user in mind, not just designing because you want your design or you want your product to be better than the next person's product. Accessibility considerations is very important. Using things like area tags, A11Y accessibility, all of that. So technique for implementing best practices. So for plugin and libraries, I think that would appeal to devs, right? If you are using React, I'm sure you know things around things like Program Motion has an NPM package for that. Growingstock as well. All of these have NPM package you can integrate into your React or Vue.js app. For development techniques, the first one, CSS, JavaScript animations, as far as I'm concerned, in my opinion, those are kind of like the best, those are the best techniques for creating micro interaction because of performance, right? CSS essentially helps you, when you write your CSS well, optimize it, it helps you handle things at a much efficient rate than using plugins and libraries, because plugins and libraries, when you import them, usually they have tens of thousands of code that you might never even get to use, right? Something that will take you maybe 8 lines of JavaScript or 8 lines of CSS in some cases. If you use a plugin for that, you might be importing tens of thousands of code, which unconsciously will slow down your performance of your app. So just something to keep in mind. Now, the real world example of my good micro interactions are the Instagram like animations, when you double tap on the post, LinkedIn typing indicator, not necessarily peculiar to LinkedIn. A lot of services use this as well, where when you are typing, the user on the other hand, on the other side of the, like for instance, implementing maybe your chat mechanism, right, using something like say some kind of IE, for instance, right, the user at the other side of the connection, right, would know that something is going on. Connection is open, so they know that something is going on with. Everything doesn't just have to be, simple loading. What they do in essence is instead they show phrases, right, quotes. So your stuff is loading and they tell you, just come up with interesting quotes, right? So as far as designing your micro interaction, essentially follow the series of steps, right? If you're a dev, you're not familiar with too much design, it doesn't have to be bells and whistles, but if you have designs, it makes sense because it makes sense to kind of see what your design looks like. If you have stakeholders, you run it by stakeholders, and this will typically consist of your designer having to prototype this in probably XD, Figma, and all of that, of which eventually, as a dev, you now end up converting this into solutions, right? So as far as conclusions, they may be small, right? It might not look like much, but I guarantee you, it's like saying you're trying to browse a service with JavaScript turned off, and 2 people are trying to browse the same service, one with JavaScript turned off, one with JavaScript on. You will be able to see the impact those little micro interactions make to make a very memorable experience for the user. Yeah, so I wanted to also show an example of very cool micro interactions here. So this is an example of a company detail form where if you can you just scroll this briefly. Yeah. No, down just a bit. Scroll down a bit, just a bit. So where if for instance you enter a company name, so in the company name field, try entering something like, say, any company, maybe Nike, for instance, right? Now, when you click out of here, now, so now this is like when you have a on mouse out events, right, in JavaScript. What happens is, right, it just uses the first letter of whatever you type as a company logo. Now, if a user is trying to move so fast, this saves user a lot of time, right? This is micro interaction, right? You just type N, whatever you type, use the first letter as a company logo. And if you decide to proceed here, it's fine. Or if you decide to proceed further, say you go to website, for instance, and you type maybe your company website, so let's say Nike.com or something, right? What happens here is that the system will now then try to pull in your logo from the internet, right? And then even though it does this, you still have the option to override if you want to by clicking upload, right? But this just comes to show that micro interaction can go a long way. It's not just all about, say, what's in, it's about the experience of the user, right? So as far as this, in case you're wondering how an implementation of this is done, there's an API for this that pulls in company logos from the internet. So it uses things like Google search, your logo appearing on Google search, and social media like Twitter. But there's one API you call, which is the Clearbit, right? Clearbit API. So if you're interested in that, I think I had that tab opened. I just created this for this purpose. So there's a code pen stuff I opened there, second to last tab. Yeah. So for this is just basic stuff, right? Like I said, everything doesn't necessarily have to be from scratch, especially if you have, everything doesn't have to be plugins and packages, especially if you have the time to craft it. So what I did with this was essentially just 4 lines of code, right? 4 lines of HTML, essentially just implemented slider feature of this, where each block kind of imports from the previous block with SSH. So I think that'll be all. If you have any questions, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Patrick. Any questions, please? Question! Look at Vicky. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. You said something about piloting before. However, you want to piloting, someone would want to keep it and to know like loading. So what I understand about what you said is that that loading, how much does it like it's not like what you want to take before it's load finished? Okay, like you are saying that maybe that way it's not much like user friendly like that. So is there any way that maybe the particular thing that will pop up that will make it more user friendly?
Okay, let me have your question.
So thank you for the speech. So the question is implementing the animations and spinner effects. So is there a situation whereby it will be slow? Because nowadays our callbacks are running very fast. Do you guys implement maybe web caches or CDNs, or like how do you make sure that the functionality is very perfect and the user does not have to keep on waiting? So what are the cache implementation or load balancing techniques that you do to make it faster?
So what I meant initially was, with the analogy of the button, is that if you have a button where when a user clicks on that button, all you do is to change the text, right? If you understand JavaScript, so that means like say text content, you are replacing the text content or inner text or something like that. What happens is that if you update just the text to something else, say loading or please wait, right? Without any form of micro interaction to show that the process is ongoing. So a text change is not enough, right? If you landed on the web page and all you saw in the middle of the page was loading, and that's all, just loading, right? Just loading. There's no indicator, just loading, right? You don't know how long you're waiting for. So that's why in more superior experiences, some people use things like calculate how much DOM has been loaded to the user browser, for instance. So you see things like 100, 98, 97, all of that you count, or a loading indicator, but something that just shows, aside just text, which is static, which is the issue, the text is static. But anything that is non-static that shows that the process is ongoing, I think that's like either you combine it or a much better approach. So his question was around how do you solve the issue of having to make multiple requests, kind of, right? How do you solve that issue, right? Of having to make multiple requests, like making it faster for the end user. Now, a way around that, it depends on how much content you are willing to. Caching is not just all about caching, right? Caching is a good technique, but caching makes sense when you are when you know that it will cost a lot for the user to kind of go to the server every now and then, right? Which is a good approach. Is if your system is very data intensive, right? An approach to look at is probably implementing your service as a PWA, for instance, right? But if it's not, if you don't want to store a lot of assets on user clients, you typically want to do things like maybe use any of the storage available for the clients, maybe local storage, session storage, it depends on how long you want it to last, right? And I think, yeah, that answers his question. Thank you.